first time. Greetings, everyone. Kalisperasis. Good evening and welcome to the Greek Centre. I would like to pay my respects to the true owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay homage to the elders past, present and emerging. Well, it's great to be back at the mezzanine level and get to interact with real people, shake real hands and give real hugs. Going forward, all our seminars for the rest of the year will be at the mezzanine level at the Greek Centre, while we'll be simultaneously streaming them on Facebook and YouTube to maximise our audience reach and participation. So all the real people will be coming to the mezzanine and the plastic people will be following us through cyberspace. So, where there are local presenters, they'll be invited to present from the Greek Centre, and non-locals will be projected on the big screen behind us. Just a few housekeeping items. Don't forget tomorrow evening's event at 7 p.m. at the mezzanine level, same location, with Professor Vrasidas Karalis from the University of Sydney and poet Tina Yannoukas. It will be a live poetry recital of Dionysius Solomos' classic The Free Besieged, depicting the siege of Missolonghi during the Greek War of Independence. Another event not to be missed is the concert by Dimitris Bassis on the 29th of May. He'll be performing songs of liberation by Titsanis, Xarchakos, Hatzidakis, Theodorakis, and other Greek composers. Now let's return to tonight's seminar, Practicing Virtue, Why It Shouldn't Hurt to Be Good, by Professor Margaret-Cameron. And in this regard, I'd like to thank Helen Bardalis Vlachos and George Vlachos for their sponsorship, and encourage you all to sponsor a seminar of your choice. We still have around half a dozen seminars without sponsors at this stage. Have a look at the program on the website. Now let's move to tonight's seminar. It's amazing how books written centuries ago can still start a spark in our modern minds. And Aristotle's ethics, or more specifically, Nicomachean ethics, is definitely one of those, and it remains forever relevant. Aristotle's ethical treatises not only continue to be widely read today, but continue to influence philosophers. Aristotle emphasized the practical importance of developing virtue, which is excellence of character, as a way to achieve what is finally more important, in the end, excellent conduct or praxis. The virtuous person acts in the right way, at the right time, in the right place, for the right reason, and with the right people. The virtuous person is what Aristotle called the spoudeos, or an excellent person, who becomes a model for the rest of us. The virtuous person knows what is good and right and chooses it on a consistent basis, avoiding activity that is not in line with virtue, and enjoys acting virtuously. It's very important. Such consistent behavior leads to eudaimonia, which can be translated as well-being, happiness, or my preference, human flourishing. But what does it mean to be a virtuous person in today's world? Are the virtues transcribed by Aristotle still relevant to today's modern world? Does being virtuous have to be painful? These and other questions will be addressed by tonight's speaker, Professor Margaret-Cameron. A bit of background on Professor Cameron. She completed her BA in English and Philosophy at the University of Toronto, which was then followed by an MA in Philosophy at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, and finally returning to the University of Toronto to complete her PhD. You might have guessed by now she's Canadian. Still can't see the hockey stick in her bag, but yeah, I think it's a good guess. And, she's had a variety of teaching and research roles in the US, UK and Canada, and in 2015 was appointed the Associate Dean of Research, Faculty of Humanities, University of Victoria in British Columbia. Since 2019, she's been the Professor of Philosophy at the University of Melbourne and the head of the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. Firstly, on behalf of the Greek community of Melbourne, I'd like to congratulate you on that appointment. We were supposed to have this seminar last year, but COVID upturned things, not just for us, for many other people as well. So it's been a bit of a delayed introduction to the Greek Centre for Professor Margaret-Cameron. Her areas of expertise include medieval philosophy, Aristotle and Aristotelian tradition, history and the philosophy of language and mind, and history of logic. But enough for me. I'm going to pass on the baton to Professor Margaret-Cameron. A big round of applause for our speaker tonight, please.
All right, thank you very much, Nick, and for being so patient with me as we set this up and got this organized. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd like to thank the sponsors for enabling this talk tonight. So, as advertised, this talk is about Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics and why this book, why this lesson is still relevant for us today. So, the first words of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics are the following: every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and choice, is thought to aim at some good. That's a bold statement. Some have taken it to be true. Many others have thought that there's something deeply wrong with it. These words introduce Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, written by Aristotle in the 4th century BC, and have been read by thousands upon thousands of people. This book formed an important part of the curriculum of study in universities for hundreds of years, and has produced an ethical framework that has been adopted by monotheistic religions and many other people around the world. Great philosophers such as Averroes in the Middle Ages and St. Thomas Aquinas have commented on this work in detail in a way that reflects their medieval interpretations of this ancient material. And many modern thinkers are still adapting it in 2021 to fit our contemporary lives. Aristotle's ethics is driven by one important question: what does it mean to live a good life? What is the good life for a human being? Now, when writing this book, Aristotle was primarily thinking about the good life for free-born men in Athens. We'll return to that point later. He also refers to men throughout the text, and I'll refer more broadly to human beings because I think and am firmly convinced that everything he says applies equally well to all genders. Imagine asking your friends and family what they thought would be a good life. Now, we all have some friends who are driven by money and money only. They went to school and university in order to get a good job, in order to get a good living, so that they could buy nice things, or perhaps so that they could pay for their families and pass wealth on to their children and their grandchildren. Others are driven by the pursuit of honors and fame. Think of politicians who get into the game for the honor it bestows, or footballers or actors. While they undoubtedly probably enjoy their craft, they sometimes only do it because they think it's going to make them famous. And then there are others who just want to lead a life of pleasure. They enjoy taking it easy at work, avoiding challenges, avoiding attempts to be saddled with greater responsibilities. They want to enjoy the company of their family and their friends. They want to take it easy on the weekend, and generally they want to do everything they can to avoid boredom, which is a kind of pain or unpleasantness. These are all very common goals and aims in people's lives. However, what Aristotle asks each of these sorts of people is this: what do you want the money for? What do you want the fame for? And for what purpose are you pursuing a life of pleasure? Isn't there something beyond all of these goals, something common to human beings that drives our decisions in our lives? Moreover, Aristotle thinks if you lead a life in pursuit of wealth and wealth alone, and this is taken away from you by, say, a financial crisis or by theft, what are you left with in your life? Similarly, with fame, and I think we can think about this in, especially in today's social media age, we have seen famous people's reputations destroyed within hours, never to be recovered again. And it goes without saying that a life dedicated to enjoying only the pleasant things is the most vulnerable of all. Pain in life is all too common and can be brought about so easily. What we should pursue in life, then, Aristotle thinks, should have two basic characteristics. First, he says, it must be complete, right? What we aim for must not be something that once acquired leaves us thinking, what's next? What more is there to be had in life? As Aristotle says, we call complete without qualification, that which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else, never to get something more beyond that. And second, he says, it should be self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency, he says, is that which, when isolated, if we are isolated, makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. As we emerge from the year 2020, as Melburnians locked in isolation for the greater part of that year, we should clearly be giving a lot of thought to that reflection about what self-sufficiency means, even when isolated. Now, there's one thing Aristotle thinks that fits both criteria, and this, he says, in what I take to be the worst translation into English, is happiness. He says, happiness then is something complete and self-sufficient, and it's the end or the purpose or the goal, the telos of action. Of course, there will be lots of intervening steps along the way, and we deliberate about these steps all the time. If I do this, then I can get this. Then I'll be this way, and then I'll go get this, and so on. We can deliberate about the means, but we do not deliberate about the goal or the purpose of our lives. And this, Aristotle says, is happiness. This seems on the surface of things both right, but also perhaps a little superficial. People are all different, they have different values, they have different aspirations. So how can there be one ultimate goal or one ultimate good for everyone? Aristotle was aware of this type of question. And so he wondered if it would help if we could know the function of human beings. By function, he meant their characteristic activity, the thing about human beings that distinguishes them from any other species or thing in the world. So, consider a flute player, somebody who plays the flute, or a sculptor, or any other type of artist or artisan. Each has a function or characteristic activity, and it's in this activity that the good or the well-being of them is found. So the function of the flute player is to play the flute. The function of the good flute player is to play the flute well. Quite obviously, parts of humans and animals also have characteristic activities or functions. There's a peculiar and specific function had by the eyes, which is to see, by the ears, to hear. Our hands, thumbs, livers, hearts, and so on all have characteristic functions. This seems obvious. But do human beings as a species have a function, a characteristic activity? Does an individual human, qua human, and not qua flute player or lawyer or so forth, have a function? The answer for Aristotle is yes. The proper activity of human beings is this. He says, now, if the function of man is an activity of the soul in accordance with the rational principle, if this is the case, human good turns out to be activity of the soul in conformity with excellence, and if there are more than one excellence, in conformity with the best and the most complete. In short, the function, the characteristic activity of human beings is to reason and to use our reason. This is the feature that distinguishes us, according to Aristotle, as a species from all other worldly things. Aristotle then adds a caveat. He says, but we must add, in a complete life. For one swallow, as in one bird, for one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day, and so too one day or a short time does not make man blessed and happy. So he's saying this needs to be a continuous part of the way we engage in the world as human beings. So, as you all know, I would like to pause and reflect on this word happy. This is a translation, obviously, of the Greek word eudaimonia, which means good-souled, more or less. This is not the modern sense of the word happy, as when we ask questions like, are you happy today? Or do these shoes make you happy? Or do these puppies make you happy? Right? Happiness, in Aristotle's sense, is not a feeling. It's not a psychological feeling that comes and goes. It's an activity of the soul when it has accomplished certain goals. And once acquired, it can't be taken away. I prefer not to use the word happy, even though you'll find that in virtually every translation into English, because of the connotations of a fleeting or temporary psychological feeling. I think it's better to think of eudaimonia in terms of flourishing, Right? So think of the condition of a healthy or flourishing plant. We say the plant is living well, it's faring well. We should also pause over the word soul, which has been overlaid for many years with all sorts of medieval and contemporary connotations. The word soul translates the ancient Greek word psyche, which is properly translated, I think, as breath. The soul is quite simply that which gives life to things. Living humans have souls, as do living animals, such as cats, dogs, horses, and centipedes. Any living thing, according to Aristotle, and I love this conception of the natural world thought of in this way, any living thing has a soul. Even living plants are ensouled. So I always go through this exercise when I go into the Coles or the Woolies, and you go through the vegetable section and you see piles of carrots sitting there ready for purchase. According to Aristotle's theory, those carrots are dead carrots. They're carrots in name only because they're not the living, vital thing that is in the ground and capable of reproducing. So just so you know, you've all been eating dead carrots. Another important point to note, the flourishing life for Aristotle should be a pleasant life. It should feel pleasurable to be living well and faring well. Now, we don't seek this happy life because it brings us pleasure. That would make pleasure the highest human good. Rather, a feeling of pleasure should attend to, or should ride on top of, a flourishing life. Another way to put this point is that it should not hurt to be happy. It should not hurt to flourish. In fact, Aristotle recommends that we use the pains and pleasures that attend all of our decisions and actions as a moral guide. He says, moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It's on account of pleasure that we do bad things, and on account of pain that we abstain from the noble ones. Hence, we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by the things that we should, and for this is the right education. In other words, we don't tend to think about, in contemporary moral theory, our emotions as playing a big role in our ethical life, right? We kind of put them to the side and we follow certain rules. You know, would I wish this upon other people? Am I making the most number of people happy by my decision? Whereas for Aristotle, our emotional lives were completely bound up in this question about how do I live a happy and successful and flourishing life. This means then we should be feeling pleasure by the right things, but we should also be pained by the right things. That's part of our moral education. Now, we can't achieve happiness by sheer force of will or mental control. We live in a complex world that's beyond the walls of our internal lives. Sure, there's plenty to be found in our inner mental lives, our thoughts, desires, a rich range of emotions, our memories, our worries, and so forth. But we also need to look at certain things in the external world in order to be morally fulfilled. So Aristotle says something quite shocking on this point, and so this is a slightly longer quotation, but it's worth reading. He says, evidently, he said, happiness needs external things as well. We can't just be happy in our own minds. We need the world. We need to interact with the world to be happy. He says, for it's impossible, or at least not easy, to do good acts without the proper equipment. In many actions, we use friends and riches and political power as instruments. And there are some things, the lack of which takes away from a happy life, such as good birth, satisfactory children, and beauty. Or sorry, I should say adds to a happy life, such as good birth, satisfactory children, and beauty. And he says, for the man who is very ugly in appearance, or is ill-born, or is solitary, or childless, is hardly happy. And perhaps a man would be still less so if he had thoroughly bad children or friends, or had lost good children or friends by death. This is a striking set of claims to make. And one question we need to ask ourselves is whether this list of things that could prevent a person from achieving a flourishing life, such as being childless, or even worse, having terrible children. I mean, Aristotle has this really interesting theory that you could have led the best life possible in terms of moral virtue and have been recognized for having led that life throughout throughout the whole thing. And suppose you die, and your child goes on to be a murderer or a thief or a corrupter or an adulterer, whatever terrible thing we want to say. Your virtue is adversely harmed by your children's behavior, according to Aristotle. So be good to your children and grandchildren. Consider the parent of a murderer or tyrant, right? It seems to bear some truth that somehow your virtue is reflected in their behavior. We can imagine that their lives would be shattered and that genuine happiness would be elusive in that case. But we also know of many childless people whose lives are no less successful, no less flourishing than those with children. I'll put this aside right now, but we can perhaps take this up if you want to later. So the question then is, how do we acquire happiness for ourselves? How do we get into this flourishing condition? We're not born happy, although we're born with the potential to lead a flourishing life. How then do we activate or actualize this inborn potential? It doesn't come about by chance, and it's not given to us by God. We do so by cultivating the right sorts of habit. Becoming a moral being is literally, for Aristotle, an exercise in habituation. And the activities that we choose to engage in determine the character of our lives. What we're seeking to do is engage our souls in activities that result in a happy life that's immune from unhappiness, even if we suffer misfortune. It's a condition of the soul that can't be removed, even with the loss of other goods in life, such as if we lose all of our money, or our families, our friends, a job, and so forth. Now, if one lost all of those things, in the extreme scenario, it would not be possible to exercise the soul in such a way to be happy, according to Aristotle. Aristotle is a very far cry away from the Stoics, who thought that you could be put on a torture rack for the rest of your life, and if you had your soul in the right condition, you could nonetheless still be flourishing as a human being. So I want to return to Aristotle's point about the characteristic activity or function of human beings, which is to use our reason. For us, Aristotle, and to be honest, most other philosophers have thought it's the capacity to reason, and by reason I mean reason in a very distinctively human type way, that sets us apart. The right use of reason is what should organize our lives in a way so that we can thrive. Just consider how deeply ingrained this idea is within cultures around the world, right? So, we commonly call a person who makes mess after mess after mess a pig, right? Or we call a cheating husband a dog. We label comatose patients as being in a vegetative state, indicating the absence of active reason. All of these animal and vegetative words that we're using are meant to indicate that despite somehow continuing to remain identifiable as a person, some people may have lost their proper status as fully human. So it's the activity of reason that makes us fully human. But this is not a prescription to become like Spock on Star Trek or becoming a robot in some sense. On the contrary, Aristotle recognizes that we have and will always have a deep and meaningful emotional life, and we will always have needs and wants and desires and appetites. We need to meet the basic demands of our bodies, and we will always be intertwined in the vast and complex world of politics, finance, other people and things. In order to be happy then, what we need to do is to learn to interact with all of these things in what's usually translated as a virtuous way, but what I want to call an excellent way, in a way that we can be excellent as humans. So what are these things that we need to interact with? What comes about in our day-to-day life that confronts us, that the interaction with which really matters about how well our life goes? Well, other people, right? First and foremost, we are constantly interacting with other people. The world of money and commerce, political structures, but also our own appetites and desires, whether those are physical appetites, sexual appetites, desires for things, and of course, our emotions. We need to find a way to interact with these things that are external to us that allows us as humans to be complete and self-sufficient. This is not desert island ethics. This is a guide. The Nicomachean ethics is a guide for learning how to become a flourishing human being in a very complex and messy world. The rest of the text is all about this. It's dedicated to finding ways of interacting with our own minds and the external world. What Aristotle identifies are the various ways that our human souls can be excellent with respect to all of these different things. These excellences are what Aristotle called virtues, or arete. And what follows, I'm going to focus on the moral virtues, which are acquired by habituating ourselves with regard to our own emotions, our own desires, and things that we encounter outside of us. It's really important to recognize that for Aristotle, there's no one-size-fits-all model that can be used by everyone in the same way in order to lead a flourishing life. So take, for example, the virtue of courage, which is his preeminent virtue. Think of something that you've gone through in your life when you said to yourself, I'm not brave enough to do this, or I don't think I've got the emotional strength for that. Perhaps it's getting up on stage to perform in a talent show, or it was asking someone out on a date, or perhaps asking for a raise at your job when you believed you deserved it but were afraid to say so. In a more extreme situation, perhaps you felt you lacked the courage to stand up to a bully or an aggressor who confronts you on the street. What would it mean for you to have the right amount of courage to deal with these situations as you wished? There's no single amount of courage that's appropriate for everyone in all these scenarios. Courage, like a dose of medicine or an amount of food, is relative to the condition and experience of each individual person. So just as you wouldn't administer an adult-sized dosage of painkillers to a baby, you probably wouldn't consume the same number of calories in a day that someone training to be an Olympic athlete would. But there is a right amount of medicine that suits a baby and a right caloric intake for your body mass and fitness lifestyle. So too, at different stages in your life, there's an appropriate amount of courage for you to display. And you will know when you've achieved the virtue because it won't hurt you. It won't hurt you. You won't feel physically afraid. You won't be physically damaged and all the other ways pain can manifest. But rather, you'll feel a particular sense of pleasure, a kind of knowing pleasure that this was the right way for you to behave. Consider the case of stage fright. If you've been practicing, say, a new musical instrument for just 6 months, it would be terribly frightening to think of going on stage to perform in front of hundreds of people. The pain that this prospect raises in you, the pain in the form of the fear of worries about being embarrassed, that feeling of shame of doing wrong, that pain that you feel is actually a guide to the appropriate moral behavior that you should be exhibiting. It tells you that you need to start smaller, given your experience and your current conditioning. You would at that point be considered brave to perform perhaps in front of your family and a few close friends. The same is true for bigger and more dramatic acts of courage. Courage as a virtue, according to Aristotle, is a mean between two extremes, right? So if we have courage as a mean, it's between the two extremes of fear on the one hand and overconfidence on the other. In the case of stage or performance anxiety, in the previous example, that person's desire to go on stage while being too experienced gave rise to fear. And had they actually gone on stage to perform, they would have been, morally speaking, unvirtuous. But let's see the other extreme that anchors the scale of bravery, namely overconfidence or rashness. So imagine an inexperienced pilot. He decides, or she decides, they want to fly a very long and dangerous mission to rescue someone stranded in a remote location. Perhaps from playing too many video games, or perhaps from a lack of self-awareness, the pilot decides to take the trip anyway. Here too, the pilot would lack virtue with regard to this decision and this action. Even if the trip were a success, even if that person successfully rescued the person on this mission, Aristotle would consider that to be a lucky one-off. For exhibiting the virtue is something that must be done consistently, and once a virtue is acquired, as he says, it cannot be lost. So this idea of locating a virtue between two extremes is a very interesting one. So I'll just give you a few other examples. If we're talking about honor and honors and how we should treat honors in our life, there is a virtue with regard to honor, which is you should feel proud. You should feel proud, justly proud of the things you've achieved. But you could be unduly humble, saying, I didn't deserve this, this wasn't worth it, I didn't deserve to be honored in this way. Or you could be extremely vain on the other end. Where the virtue is for you depends on your experience, depends on your knowledge, depends on your intentions, and depends on, frankly, where you are at your stage in life. Good temperedness is considered to be a virtue. This is the virtue that has to do with this really difficult aspect in our lives, which is our feelings of anger, right? We have to be good-tempered because we are angered by things. You could be vicious on the one extreme by being overly obliging. So somebody makes you angry and you just back down. Or you could be extreme on the other end, which is you could be, with regard to anger, constantly angry, which would also be vicious. Where this fits for you is relative to the condition that you're in. Being good-tempered is considered a virtue, but we all know that it's impossible to be good-tempered all the time. And there are even some times when it would be inappropriate for us to be in a good mood. Aristotle recognized this fact. Being in a good mood, having a good temper, helps society get along, and it keeps pacific relations in the workplace and in our households. But just as there are occasions when it's morally wrong or morally vicious to exhibit an explosion of anger, so say somebody steps on your foot accidentally, or someone asks you to wear a mask during a global pandemic, there are also occasions when it is right, when it's morally justifiable to actually get angry and show it, right? And this is where the mean comes in as very useful in thinking of if the vice is found at both extremes, there's a mean, but it's relative to the situation, to your conditioning. So for example, there are occasions when it is right to get angry, a situation which Aristotle called a display of righteous indignation. If someone insults your children without any reason, or if your partner has a secret love affair that you discover, it would not be morally defensible for you simply to shrug your shoulders and get on with things. It's wrong to let people walk all over us. The morally defensible thing in that case, and where the virtue is, it lies in getting angry, justifiable anger. There are lots of virtues that Aristotle includes. There's virtues that have to do with being truthful. There are virtues that have to do with being a good conversationalist in, not in parties, but when we encounter one another. So the virtue of being witty, right? Not letting all the people around you do the work of enabling the conversation. There are virtues that have to do with ourself, for example, in terms of cultivating a certain degree of modesty, both psychological and physical. There was another really interesting virtue, though, that I just want to point out, which is the virtue of friendship. Aristotle had a lot to say about the virtue of friendship. He classified different types of friendship, ones with which we're all familiar. So there are friendships of utility. You just need to get along in order to get a project done, but you actually do feel kind of kinship with that person. Friendships between unequals. Friendships with our own family members. Friendships that we've lost and remember. Thinking about a person who has achieved all the virtues after lifelong practice and reflection, about a person considered truly happy, truly flourishing, Aristotle asked, would a genuinely happy person even need friends? He says, do we need friends more in good fortune or in bad? They are sought after in both, for while men in adversity need help, in prosperity they need people to live with and to make the objects of their goodwill, for they wish to do well by others. Friendship then, he says, is more necessary in bad fortune, but it's more noble it's of greater value, and good fortune. For the very presence of friends is pleasant, both in good fortune and also in bad, since grief is lightened with friends' sorrow with us. Hence, he says, one might ask whether they share, as it were, our burden, or without that happening, their presence by its pleasantness. And the thought of their grieving with us makes our pain less. How do we acquire virtues, like the virtue of friendship, or courage, or justice? Aristotle says being able to act from a firm and unchanging character. So these are not one-off behavioral traits. He says choosing the right decision or action towards the right people at the right time and the right reasons for you and the condition that you're in with the right experiences under your belt, this all seems rather daunting. Aristotle answers in the following way. You should always do, as you're practicing towards virtue, as you're becoming a virtuous person, you should always do what the virtuous person would do. If that sounds like unhelpful advice, consider a very similar human experience. Think of the experience of becoming a musician. So for example, a violinist. When you first pick up the instrument and the sheet music, you're not a violinist. You have the potential to be a violinist, but this potential has yet to be activated. Whether consciously or not, all of the steps that you will take towards becoming a violinist will be determined, will be guided by what an already successful violinist would do. You learn to read sheet music because that's what a violinist does. You find a teacher because that's what a violinist does. You practice and practice and practice. At first, you sound nothing like a violinist as you squeak and scratch out sounds, but you know what good violin playing looks like, and you know what it sounds like. You know, theoretically at least, what the violinist does. Each day you practice, trying your best to do what the violinist does, and you become, eventually, after lots of practice, a violinist. The idea is the same in the realm of becoming a morally virtuous person. Like learning the violin or learning to speak an additional language, you're not going to get it right on the first, second, or perhaps even the 10th try. In the realm of ethics, you're practicing towards virtue. You're doing what virtuous people do until one day you're virtuous yourself. Like learning the violin or a second language, it obviously helps your chances of success if you start very early in life. So too for practicing courage, friendliness, justice, and liberality. We all know people in life who didn't practice towards being virtuous when they were young, and now it seems that for them, it's too late. A happy life is not possible for some people. How should we think about the relevance and the value of these lessons contained in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics today? After all, Aristotle did not defend the views that he wrote in this text. He assumed, as did many other people in the ancient world, philosophers, I should say, in the ancient world, that ethical striving is actually just part of our human nature. Aristotle did not take this point as requiring any special defense. He took it for granted that acquiring virtues was inherently valuable and not to be accomplished in order to get some other further reward. This assumption has been criticized by some later thinkers as what they call the guise of the good, which means that the idea that all actions, as the first words of this book state, aim at some good. The focus of Aristotle's text on the life of a single individual's moral development has also been met with the criticism that this really isn't ethics at all. Ethics, at least, I don't know, since the 1600s, has more to do with questions such as, what do we owe one another? Or what's the greatest good for the greatest number, where that ends up being a kind of calculation. Aristotle's ethics, so-called ethics then, appears to be an exercise, his critics say, in sheer egoism. What Aristotle seems to be offering is a self-help book, not a book of morality. Moreover, it's been pointed out that if Aristotle wrote this text he wrote this text thinking primarily, if not exclusively, about free men in a financially stable environment, in a relatively free and politically stable context. This might entail that a happy life, eudaimonistic life on Aristotle's terms, is just not possible for many people in the world. It seems to require basic political stability, for example, for justice to be possible. It requires family and social networks that are dependable over time. It also requires a certain amount of material prosperity to afford the time and the energy to practice towards virtue. If you're living in poverty and you're constantly afraid you won't find a next meal, or if you live a life of violence and are dominated by fear as a result, it may seem that these virtues are just unattainable. More importantly, if you live in a household or a neighborhood or a region of the world where there are too few examples, perhaps no examples, of virtuous people, the chances of living a virtuous life might seem to be beyond your grasp. Many people, after all, grow up without ever seeing or hearing a talented violinist. These are fair points. Perhaps at the outer extreme, growing up in abject poverty or caught in the crosshairs of a long-standing violent political feud, for example, in this case, attaining the virtues that will result in a flourishing life may be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. But there's an important sense in which these criticisms enforce Aristotle's very point. Being the sorts of creatures that we are, there are certain bare minimums that are needed in order for us even to have a chance of flourishing as humans. Contemporary philosophers who follow Aristotle's theory, such as Martha Nussbaum, have developed this idea, this basic Aristotelian ethical idea, into a political theory that puts human capabilities at the forefront of how we organize our political systems. Instead of asking, as other politicians and political theorists do, how do we redistribute goods and wealth to people in order to lead a good life? A capabilities approach, an Aristotelian approach, asks, how can we ensure that basic human capabilities, to have friends, the capability to be good with resources such as money, the capability to enact justice, can be allowed and supported to flourish? There are countless other things to say about Aristotle's ethics. Normally I take about 12 weeks in a semester to go through it. This book has been read by heaps and heaps of people and was studied, as I mentioned at the outset, by every university student until the modern era. You can find thousands of academic commentaries on it, not to mention loads of scholarly articles and books. Recently, there's been a very serious resurgence of virtue ethics discussions and debates in academia, largely following Aristotle. And why not? We still ask ourselves the fundamental question that guides Aristotle in this book: what does it mean to live a good life? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cameron, and I'm sure we'll have some questions from the floor. Let me just quick start the questioning. In his writings, does Aristotle say anything about the Olympian gods? Does he advocate behavior to please gods or something like that? Is there anything like that in his writings?
No. I mean, so I could say he might have in some of his other writings, but what's really interesting about what we have in Aristotle's writings are his lecture notes from teaching at his school. So these lecture notes were written, I mean, this was written as a dedication, so this is actually the most public work, but most of Aristotle's writings were written for his students who are already kind of educated in his system of thought, and so they're very technical, and there are very few flourishes that that reference things that would be interesting to the public, right? Things that would be part of general culture, like the gods, right? that's just an accident of the transmission of the works of Aristotle, that we don't have the writings he wrote to the public, where he might have, as somebody who wanted to convince people to be converted to his way of thinking about things philosophically, invoked the gods and talked about their relationship to us in our ethical lives. But no, it's not to be pleasing to the gods whatsoever. This is a thoroughly, I say, humanistic ethics. Yeah.
Just got a question here that's been sent through one of our Facebook followers. What is the difference between Stoic indifference of status, social and health, and Aristotelian ethics? Thank you for the talk, Professor Cameron.
Thank you for that question. So, Stoic philosophy, which was the philosophical school that probably lasted the longest, had the most profound effect in its day, and yet has left so little trace in the historical record, was eudaimonistic in the same sense that Aristotle's philosophy is eudaimonistic. So it identified that the flourishing life, the happy life, was the purpose of our lives. But they followed a much more Socratic lead. So Socrates, if we're starting out our trio of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, Socrates held a very rationalistic view about how we live our moral lives. And he believed that if you genuinely understood that something was bad, right, if you held that as a rational belief, and you really knew that to be the case, then you wouldn't do it, right? So then, people would point out to Socrates and say things like, but people do, right? Like, think of the warning labels on smoking, right now, on cigarettes right now. People read these warning lines, and they go, oh yeah, cigarettes will kill me, and then they pull out a cigarette and smoke it, right? We know that this is part and parcel of human behavior, and it has been for always. But Socrates did believe this. And so it was really the introduction by Plato and then Aristotle of the importance of human will and the emotional life as playing a part of our moral reasoning. So it can't just be a purely rationalistic way of dealing with ethics. When the Stoics came along, they sort of reverted a little bit to that Socratic idea that something was really important about human rationality. And so they thought that the only things of value were virtues and leading a rational life, and everything else we needed to cultivate an attitude of being indifferent towards. And so we have no strong inclinations towards, even our own lives, for example, right? If that's getting in the way somehow of cultivating virtue. And so what they advocated then was, and this is very unlike Aristotle, who took the emotional life as being a very big part of our ethical life. They said, let's suppose you become incredibly sad because your dog died or because your mother died, right? Which we do, and that feels like a normal thing. The Stoics' response to that is to say, no, you're not experiencing an emotion. This is not sadness. This is just ignorance of the truth that all biological things die. And once you rationally accept everything that can be known by humans about the natural world, and you know it, right? Think back to Socrates, and you know it, you're not going to have that emotion about it. You're just going to, it will become yet another of the indifference in our lives. Now, they weren't advocating that we become, robotic, as I mentioned in the paper, or anything like that. They said, it's healthy to be hopeful about your children, and it's helpful to be cautious about crossing the road and looking both ways, right? I mean, all things considered, we want to be able to reason for as long as we can. But they introduced this idea that there was a whole swath of human life that we actually need not fold into our ethical life, but rather we just need to rationally understand and then treat as being indifferent to us.
Okay.
That's an excellent question, by the way.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Okay, they're normally not a shy lot. Okay, I'll read the next question. It's a long one.
Uh-oh.
What do you think Aristotle would have to say about virtue signaling, where large corporations, public figures, and others make public expressions of cultural Marxist ideas, not because they generally believe in what they're saying, but more so they can avoid an aggressive attention of activists in the media?
That's an excellent question. And I also find it very interesting that the modern expression is virtue signaling. I mean, that in and of itself is interesting. So Aristotle would find it abominable because it is doing a virtuous act for the sake of acquiring some other good that has nothing to do with the moral life. So we practice virtuous acts for some other purpose, namely to ultimately become thoroughly virtuous people, so that everything we do and all of our actions has as its end being a good person, right? Being a morally good person in such a way that nobody can take that away from us. When these corporations engage in these virtue signaling activities, they are doing it probably in every case for their bottom line, for profits. They're afraid that without making certain kinds of statements or actions about, you know, Black Lives Matter or, you know, whatever other cause that they want to fall behind, that they're going to lose consumers, they're going to lose profits. And so they are abusing the expression of virtue in order to achieve some non-moral end, and this to Aristotle would be the worst type of behavior possible. Right.
Would that extend to climate change?
Pardon me?
Would that extend to climate change? Anyway, no, I was just joking.
Yes.
Okay. I know you've got a loud voice, Tim, but unless you want to come to the front and.
No, that's fine. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure, like many people, it made me reflect on myself, especially my violin playing, which after 10 lessons I still listen for a violin player. So thank you. I was thinking about when you said it's not just about oneself, but also about other people. That particularly resonated, I thought, and it made me think of two things, two questions, I suppose. What would Aristotle say to the sort of lesson that I was brought up with, which is not so much do something because it will mean you're a good person, but treat someone as you would want to be treated yourself, so being less focused on yourself. And the second one was a quote someone sent me yesterday from the modern philosopher Terry Pratchett. And I'm not a fan of Terry Pratchett, I've got to say. And they clearly sent me this quote because they thought I'd agree with it, and I didn't, and I'll be interested to know what you think, but what Aristotle would think as well. And that is that the most enjoyment to be got from something is knowing that somewhere there is someone who won't approve of what you're doing. What a question.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question. So, broadly speaking, the context in which you were raised is what philosophers would call Kantian and what most people would call Christian. So Kant, who was a Christian, Immanuel Kant, right, 18th century philosopher, changed the way we think about virtually everything. Probably against Aristotle, the second most philosopher of the Western tradition. He developed an ethical theory, which is part of what I was referring to as the sort of rule-based ethical theories, right? Where you apply it when you're in an ethical situation, you're in a quandary, you don't know what to do. He thought there's a rule you can apply, and the rule is act in such a way that whatever you do, you could universalize this amongst everybody, right? And that includes then you being treated in that way, right? It's a version of the Christian golden mean, right? One of the things that I think accounts for the reason of the return of Aristotle's ethics as a competitor ethical theory is because rule-based ethics, where there are two big ones, right? So Kant's universalization principle. Can I act in such a way that I would universalize this action? Would it be okay for everybody to do? And then there's also the principle that says, will this action that I undertake create the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers of people? These are calculations then that people are being thought to do when they're confronted with a moral situation. There's a real bareness to that, right? I mean, I don't think that I've ever in any situation thought to myself, should I write this email? Could I will that this email is universalizably sent out to the rest of the world? And this is like, we don't think that way. We think from within this context of the sort of messiness of being a human being, the fleshiness, the desirousness, the need for friends, the need for money, the fact that we're under all these politically stable systems. And a large part, I think, of what is right about Aristotle is, he's writing a prescriptive book about how we should behave, but it's also largely descriptive. It's sort of tracking what we do when we're confronted with this situation, and we ask ourselves, what would I identify my mother, let's say, as a very virtuous person. Like, what would my mother do? I mean, you can see how well this then slipped into and formed the basis for the monotheistic religious faiths, because you have in the figure of Jesus Christ the perfectly virtuous man. And there are, I don't know if this is true in Australia, but in the United States and some parts of Canada, there are these evangelical young people who actually wear armbands that say WWJD ? Which is what would Jesus do? Which is just a version of Aristotle saying you do what the virtuous man would do, right? They've identified this in the figure of Christ. As to the Pratchett quote, I have no idea how to answer that. What do you think?
Well, my gut reaction was they sent it to me because they thought I would think it was clever, and I just thought it was ill-judged, shall we say. Not that I've not got a sense of humour, but it's just, to be trying to think about what would not please people as opposed to making people happy, however you translate that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, empirically, I would say there are people that are like that.
There are.
We work with some of them. But no, I think it's probably true. There are people who think that way. But I mean, Aristotle's thoughts on friendship and justice are where we start to take into consideration other people. But we're guided in the first place by the development of our moral character, right? So, never would he say something like, attacking somebody else, to their disadvantage, if it advantages us and our moral development, would be a good thing, right? It's just not even within his ethical wheelhouse, so to speak.
But
Yep.
last point, he would say, wouldn't he, you can't please everyone all the time.
He would definitely agree with that, yes.
Kyrie Galanopoulos,
Okay.
are you going to come to the microphone?
According to your judgment, do you think that the word eudaimonia is exact equivalent to the English happiness?
No.
And how come that the Greeks, would drop eudaimonia, and we say happiness in Greek today means to be lucky?
Oh, interesting.
Yes, exactly.
I think this word happiness has just taken over the concept of happiness is so.
It's an industry, happiness.
It's an industry almost, exactly. And, all words have histories, right? It got introduced at a certain point into the English language. And it also then became, once there started the industry of psychology and psychiatry, the language that's foundational for that is, are you happy? Right? I mean, this is a question that we ask each other all the time. I think I have a look on my face when I'm, working out a problem at my desk, because when people walk by my office, they say to me, "You look really unhappy," and I'm like, "No, I'm actually just thinking. I'm neither happy nor unhappy. That's just, my look." So we've got this word that has just such a huge purchase in our lives. that I would say that modern Greek speakers are probably using it as borrowed from English, but not through any direct, tradition of how eudaimonia is understood from Greek antiquity. Eudaimonia, in a sense, is sort of like it's a qualifier on the soul, on the condition of the soul. It's a state that the soul is in. If there was a word for that that was more like the word healthy for bodies, I think it would be a better word, right? Like, you can have a physical condition, it's neither good nor bad, you're sort of in a good state and part of you is in a bad state. But when you're healthy, you're good on the inside and you're good on the outside, you're good all over. You're in that condition, right, of the body, which is healthfulness. There's a psychological way of being healthy too, right? So you're psychologically healthy. Unfortunately, all these words have so many connotations in our contemporary English language.
Okay, I'll just read one final question before
Sure.
we bring proceedings to a close. Do we apply the Aristotelian ethics to a group of people such as a political party? And if yes, does the Liberal Party's persecution of refugees make them unvirtuous?
This is actually a really interesting question. So yes, we can apply virtue theory to groups like political parties. There's some interesting discussion there about how we think about political parties as a unit, but we've got lots of precedent for doing this. So in law, in most jurisdictions, a corporation is treated as a person under law, right? And so they can be prosecuted as we would prosecute persons for, destroying the environment or for polluting or for, corruption or whatever else. So insofar as we are enabled to think about groups as unitary sources of action, whether that's the board of executives, that's basically like the mind of that corporate individual, or the prime minister as the mind of the government, but the government is writ large, then yes, we can say without difficulty, the government is acting without virtue, and they have not achieved the mean, and they need to find better models. I don't know, there's one across the pond from here, but they need to find better models of political leadership to identify a virtuous person whose actions they should begin to emulate.
Thank you for that. Since we've been dissecting Greek words tonight, after this seminar, we want you to reach a state of euphoria. So we've got a bottle of wine to offer you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate that.